Surely many of you have watched the American psychological horror film Orphan. At the center of the plot is a married couple who, after the death of their unborn child, adopted a 9-year-old girl from an orphanage. In the end, the little girl turned out to be not at all who she pretended to be. But this is by no means fiction. The heroine Esther has a prototype. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Today's story began in a small fishing town of Kuzim in the southeast of the Czech Republic. Only about 11,000 people lived there. It was an unremarkable little town until one horrific incident occurred there. On the morning of May 7, 2007, Edward, the father of the family, was in a state of panic. His wife was giving birth, and he was expecting a phone call from the hospital any minute. Edward was at home and, to distract himself, tried to keep busy with chores. He sat in the nursery and set up the baby monitor. It was the best model that Edward and his wife could afford. The man connected the receiver to the monitor, adjusted a clear image, and expected to see the crib standing right in front of him, which he had assembled all day. But the screen showed something completely different from what Edward saw with his own eyes. The image on the receiver did not match the real picture. Instead of the crib, the man saw a boy about 6 to 7 years old. Judging by the gloomy room, the child was in some kind of basement. The boy looked calm, but his hands were tied with duct tape. There was no clothing on him. He was completely naked. Edward twisted the receiver's knob, and the image finally changed, showing the nursery in their house with his wife. This time, everything was correct. Edward decided that it was some kind of glitch and tried to forget about the strange picture. Perhaps the receiver picked up someone else's signal that had nothing to do with reality. But the vision wouldn't leave his head. The man tried to understand what had happened, where the child appeared on the monitor instead of the nursery, inhabiting the basement, but he couldn't find an explanation. At that moment, the phone rang. The hospital reported that he had a daughter and that his wife and the baby were fine. The new father immediately headed to the maternity ward. When he returned home, he tried to catch the strange broadcast from someone else's basement again. Edward twisted the receiver's knob until the boy appeared on the monitor. Although several hours had passed, his hands were still tied. Edward understood the full seriousness of what was happening on the baby monitor screen. He pressed record in case he lost the signal or something happened. Then the man called the police and told them that while connecting the device, he accidentally stumbled upon someone's basement where a child was being held. The police responded very quickly. Edward still hoped that it was some kind of mistake, and the situation would soon resolve in the best way. But since everything looked as if the boy was being held in the basement by force, they couldn't take risks. The man showed the arriving officers the strange picture on the baby monitor screen and once again outlined the situation. The police couldn't ignore such things and began to act immediately. Since the baby monitor signal is usually quite weak, the source had to be somewhere nearby. Edward reported that he had never seen this boy from the basement before. He knew that the neighbors had a teenage daughter and 2 young sons, but he hadn't seen them for a long time. The police decided to check the neighbors' houses, but they didn't have to go far. In the very first house, they were met by 30-year-old Clara Mawarova and her sister, 32-year-old Katarzyna Mawarova, a social worker. The women were very polite. They explained that only their 13-year-old adopted daughter Anichka lived in the house, who didn't like communicating with strangers. The police asked for permission to inspect the house, and although the hostesses didn't like it, they agreed. While walking around the dwelling, the officers didn't find the girl, but their attention was drawn to a locked door to the basement in the back of the building. Clara said that she never went down there because the owner of the house didn't leave her a key. The police left, believing the women only halfway. Returning to Edward's house, they asked to turn on the monitor again. Rewinding the recorded material, the officers noticed something unusual. The recording played the same music that was in the sister's house. Turning the volume knob to full power, they heard Clara's voice and the voice of one of the officers. It was the very conversation they had with Edward's neighbor a few minutes ago. That's how they learned that the camera, whose image accidentally appeared on the baby monitor screen, was installed in the Mawarova's house. The police immediately returned to Clara's house and demanded to be let into the basement. They were sure that the unknown person was being held there by force. At that moment, Clara's 13-year-old adopted daughter Anichka appeared near the doors. However, the girl looked significantly younger than her age. Anichka crawled out on all fours, screaming "Mommy," like a very small child. Instead of approaching her adoptive mother Clara, she clung to Katarzyna like an infant. The police assumed that Anichka might have developmental delays and continued trying to break into the basement door. But suddenly, the frightened little girl with huge, trustingly wide-open eyes jumped up and rushed between the police and the door, trying to stop them. In the end, the officers had to call workers with tools to get to the lower floor of the Mawarova sisters' house. As soon as the basement door opened, an unbearable stench immediately enveloped everyone present. Then a horrific sight opened to the rescuers' eyes, which none of them would ever forget. In the dark, dirty, and damp basement was a little boy. In reality, the situation looked much worse than on the tiny receiver screen of the baby monitor. His name was Andrzej Mauer. He was Clara's 8-year-old son, but he wasn't alone. The police also found another boy, Andrzej's older brother, 10-year-old Jakub. The conditions in the basement were beyond horror. The kids were frozen and severely weakened, but despite this, both turned out to be calm and pleasant children. When the rescuers approached Andrzej, he simply raised his eyes and smiled. Clara and Katarzyna were immediately taken into custody for child abuse. The story of 2 underage victims locked in the basement immediately became public knowledge. Reporters flocked to the previously quiet little town to see the house of horrors with their own eyes. No national news outlet left this case unattended. The story caused horror and bewilderment. How could someone cause so much pain and suffering to their own children? The kids were sent to an orphanage to assess their physical and mental condition. They showed themselves to be surprisingly resilient, kind, polite children. They also eagerly grabbed toys and were ready to learn something new. But Anichka, although older than the brothers, behaved like a spoiled child. She threw tantrums and continued to persistently demand meetings with Clara and Aunt Katarzyna. The police assumed that Anichka had a developmental delay. Perhaps the teenage girl, like her younger brothers, had been subjected to some kind of violence. And then something unexpected happened. Anichka disappeared. The 13-year-old teenager escaped from the children's center. She climbed out of a window that a child could hardly open and vanished. Large-scale searches began. Meanwhile, the police and social workers desperately tried to find out from Jakub and Andrzej what was happening in their home. For what reason Clara's 2 sons ended up locked in the basement, the investigators were only able to partially reconstruct the picture of what happened over the past few years. And these were horrors beyond comprehension. What the kids went through turned out to be much worse than anyone could imagine. The family where Clara and Katarzyna were raised was very religious. They went to church every Sunday. The girls attended Sunday school and were raised in strict accordance with the 10 Commandments. During their teenage years, the sisters' interest in religion became a bit extreme. The girls began to have dreams where they were chosen ones. But Clara believed that it was her destiny to fulfill God's mission. She talked about it all the time and thought that she had divine powers and that she had to achieve something greater in this life. One day the parents caught her trying to suffocate her sister Katarzyna with a pillow, assuring that she could then bring her back to life on her own. Fortunately, the adults intervened before a tragedy occurred. At school, teachers and social workers noticed that the girls had unusual symptoms. Clara and Katarzyna claimed that they possessed superhuman powers and were God's chosen ones. These statements caused concern. Suspicions intensified when the girls started having hallucinations. The educators assumed that Clara and Katarzyna might have developed a mental illness, and they advised the parents to show their daughters to specialists for examination and possible treatment. However, Clara and Katarzyna's mother categorically rejected this idea. She didn't want to hear anything about possible problems and flatly refused to take the girls to a psychiatrist. Instead, the mother took her daughters out of school and transferred them to another educational institution. So the sisters' mental state, likely related to some disorder without treatment, continued to deteriorate. In the mid-90s, Clara turned 18. For some reason, she distanced herself from the family and stopped communicating with her sister Katarzyna. During this same period, she began a relationship with an adult man named Radek, which soon turned into marriage. It was during that period that the couple had 2 children, Jakub and Andrzej. Initially, their family was happy. They lived in an apartment. Clara studied at university, majoring in economics, and then got a job as a secretary. Everything was going great. Clara was a wonderful mother to her sons. The boys grew up in abundance, surrounded by care and attention. Their father, Radek, was a caring and loving husband. Life in the family was happy and prosperous. However, as mentioned earlier, there were suspicions that Clara suffered from an undiagnosed mental disorder. Several years later, when the woman turned 26, her condition began to worsen. She started having delusional ideas and visions again about fulfilling God's mission. Clara began to believe that her husband and children distracted her from this mission and prevented her from fulfilling her destiny. She started voicing her dissatisfactions to her husband, which led to numerous quarrels and arguments. In the end, her spouse couldn't take it and filed for divorce. Clara took the children and unexpectedly reunited with her sister Katarzyna for everyone. They moved to a separate apartment, and at first, it seemed that the parents' divorce didn't particularly affect the children. But everything changed with the appearance of Anichka. Anichka was from Norway. Katarzyna, Clara's sister, met the girl in 2006 when she worked as a social worker. Anichka was orphaned at an early age. Both her parents died. She changed several orphanages where she experienced cruel violence, and then she was sold to child molesters, where she became a victim of monstrous abuses and tortures. One day, she managed to escape. She ended up safe. However, it soon turned out that the girl had leukemia, and the chances of living to 16 were practically non-existent. Her health was extremely fragile. Learning about the difficult fate and health problems, Katarzyna took pity on the girl and convinced her sister Clara to adopt Anichka to provide her with care and support. Katarzyna also found a specialist doctor for the girl who regularly examined her and gave treatment recommendations. Although Anichka's adoptive mother was Clara, her sister forbade her to take her daughter to the hospital. Katarzyna took this responsibility entirely upon herself. The doctor communicated with Clara only by phone and email, sending messages and emails with instructions on how to care for Anichka and how to treat her ailments. For example, during one of the girl's long hospital stays, the doctor called the adoptive mother and said that she needed to talk to Anichka. Although she was unconscious and unlikely to hear her, Clara did everything to help her, despite not understanding what it was for. But this was not the strangest instruction the doctor gave to Clara Mauerova. For a long time, it seemed that Katarzyna knew much more about what was happening with Anichka than her adoptive mother. Katarzyna took the girl to the hospital, constantly met with the doctor. But Clara took it calmly, allowing her sister to care for the newly acquired niece. One day, the doctor wrote a text message to the adoptive mother. For Anichka to recover from her traumatic past, she needed to be given a lot of love, affection, and attention. Tell her more often how wonderful she is, praise her every day, and buy gifts. Clara did everything she could. It felt like, having ended up in the adoptive family, the schoolgirl decided to squeeze everything possible out of her parents. Although Anichka had no medical problems with her legs, she constantly demanded to be carried in arms like a little one. If Clara refused something, The girl threw explosive tantrums. She also threatened to leave this world if she didn't get what she wanted. Worst of all, the specialist treating the teenager for leukemia encouraged such behavior. One of the doctor's instructions was to give Anichka a full-body massage at night, paying special attention to intimate parts. The adoptive mother did as she was told, but the doctor stated that the treatment wasn't helping because Clara's sons, who were 5 and 7 years old at the time, treated the girl badly. Anichka herself seemed to feel extreme dislike for the 2 other children. She didn't want her mother to pay attention to her own sons, and the doctor supported the young patient again. The doctor directly told Clara that she needed to raise her sons more strictly, and Anichka allegedly suffered because of the negative attitude, and this delayed her recovery. In general, the doctor advised the woman to use physical punishment for her sons more often. Only in this case would her adopted daughter find peace and recover. And Clara began punishing Andrzej and Jakub. At first, these were small things. The boys were made to stand on their knees in one place for hours without the ability to move. They were locked in a closet without light, without food, and without a toilet. They were beaten for the slightest offense. Despite the fact that the intensity of the punishments constantly increased, the doctor insisted that it wasn't enough, that the mother needed to hit harder. And Clara began treating her sons with even greater cruelty. And then Clara was convinced that Andrzej and Jakub were real monsters, and Clara should forget that these were her own children. Anichka constantly complained to her adoptive mother that the boys behaved rudely with her, which made her suffer greatly. However, she herself insisted that Clara beat them harder. Incredibly, the woman obeyed and began physically punishing her sons for the most insignificant misdeeds. For some reason, Clara always believed Anichka and gradually began turning away from her own children, taking the side of the 13-year-old adopted daughter in everything. In addition to Clara starting to neglect her sons and focusing all her attention on Anichka, she also stopped taking care of herself. She stopped eating normally and caring for her appearance. She stopped showering, lost a lot of weight, and looked like a shadow of her former self. She slept 3 hours a day, didn't communicate with friends and relatives. And all this because of the teenage girl who, although still a child, behaved very calculatingly. The 13-year-old schoolgirl's eyes reflected a rich life experience, saying that in her years she had seen much more than some adults. But even that wasn't enough. The doctor treating Anichka said that allegedly Andrzej needed shock therapy too. First of all, the doctor advised Clara that the boys needed to be isolated from external influences. This meant they had to be taken out of school. Clara did just that. Now her sons were homeschooled, and they were not allowed to communicate with other family members. The boys were forbidden to see their father, with whom they met every other weekend, as well as their grandmother and grandfather, with whom they were incredibly close. At the doctor's instruction, Clara took her 2 sons to a cottage in the forest wilderness, and there the real hell began for the boys. The doctor called this place a re-education camp. In this cottage were 3 people: 29-year-old John Turek, 26-year-old Hanna Bashova, and 23-year-old Jan Skrlova. They were so-called mentors. While Clara, Katarzyna, and Anichka slept in comfort and had a great time, the boys were forced to sleep in dog cages where they couldn't even stand up to full height. Jakub and Andrzej were practically not fed, so they couldn't even resist. Bags were put over their heads, they were beaten with whatever came to hand. Their skin was scratched with sharp forks, cigarettes were extinguished on them. Their heads were repeatedly plunged into buckets of water or doused with boiling water. These cruel punishments were carried out by the 3 mentors who lived in the cottage, as well as Anichka and Katarzyna. And then Clara joined them, whose brain was so washed that she no longer saw her own sons in them. Now Clara saw them as little spawns of hell and did everything to set them on the true path. They were abused not only physically, but also morally, and they wanted to turn them against each other. They were ordered to fight and harm each other. One day, the older one was forced to dig his own grave and lie in it, pretending to be dead. Then they brought out the younger one and convinced him that it was all his fault, after which they ordered him to fill the grave with dirt. It was very scary. Andrzej burst into tears, and they calmed him by saying that allegedly he could be brought back to life, but only if the younger one behaved well. Soon after Jakub and Andrzej returned from the cottage in September 2006, where they spent several months, Clara began the official adoption of Anichka. In fact, the adoption court never saw the real Anichka. Instead, Katarzyna brought the daughter of one of the neighbors to the hearing so that she could pretend to be the orphan. At this time, Clara and Katarzyna rented a large house in a small town. Anichka had her own room there, very beautifully furnished, with a bunch of toys, clothes, and everything a teenage girl could dream of. But the tortures over Clara's own sons continued. Instead of a room, they were placed in the basement. The walls of the room were lined with soundproofing so that no one would hear the screams, and the windows were boarded up. The kids weren't let out to the toilet, so they relieved themselves in the same little room. For this, they were also punished, forced to eat their own excrement and vomit. They had to sleep on the hard floor. The only means of hygiene was a bucket of cold water that was poured over Jakub and Andrzej. The culmination of the inhuman treatment was eating flesh. At the order of the same Anichka and the mysterious doctor, Clara, without any anesthetic, cut off a piece of flesh from the buttocks of one of her sons and then cauterized the wound with a cigarette butt. There were several versions of what they did with the flesh. Either they ate it themselves or fed it to the prisoners. In any case, it was horrible. Jakub and Andrzej acted as martyrs who were supposedly to atone for the sins of humanity. It all ended when in May 2007, a neighbor, setting up a baby monitor bought for his child, accidentally connected to the camera installed in the house where the Maurovas lived. Why Clara agreed to participate in the abuses of her own sons is unknown. Perhaps the reason was an undetected mental disorder. She was a stupid, naive, and easily manipulated woman whom they managed to convince that her children were monsters. Her sister Katarzyna was part of the manipulation. She knew much more than she said and apparently simply enjoyed torturing her nephews. Katarzyna hid from her sister Clara the real information about Anichka and the strange doctor, about the people from the cottage in the forest. So, the police freed Jakub and Andrzej from the horrific basement. Now they were safe. The kids underwent a long course of rehabilitation and were able to return to normal life. A little recovered from the experienced horror, Jakub and Andrzej told the officers what happened to them, and that's when the authorities learned about the scale of the abuses and tortures these kids were subjected to. But the 13-year-old Anichka managed to escape from the temporary detention center. She couldn't be found anywhere. And that's not surprising, because in fact, there was no Anichka. Initially, the investigators thought the girl was one of the victims, but a lot of effort was spent on her search, as it was believed that Anichka was kidnapped right from the shelter. But then a letter arrived at the police in which Anichka claimed that her mother Clara was innocent. And Andrzej and Jakub were brazenly lying, saying that they were held in the basement. Of course, the investigators didn't believe the letter, since they saw with their own eyes what the kids went through. But something in this message seemed suspicious to them. The police noticed that the grammar, style, and language were too mature for a 13-year-old teenager, and this caused them serious suspicions. Now the authorities began searching for Anichka with even greater zeal. They posted her photos all over the city. One of the calls that came to the police station really shocked them. At that moment, the investigators learned that the girl Anichka never actually existed. Anichka's real name is Barbora Skrlová, and she wasn't a 13-year-old teenager. She was a 33-year-old woman, a couple of years older than her adoptive mother, Clara. She, like the heroine of the film Orphan, suffered from a rare disease, hypopituitarism, which stopped body growth and preserved childlike proportions. Hypopituitarism is an endocrine disorder associated with insufficient hormone production. But the film didn't compare at all to what happened in reality. Barbora Skrlová was born on July 20th, 1974, and was the eldest of 3 children. From childhood, she suffered from many problems related to mental health. In particular, she was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia. Barbora grew up in the Czech Republic, in a family where her mother was an alcoholic, and her father was practically absent all the time. Because of this, the girl felt lonely and abandoned. Because of the rare disease hypopituitarism, Barbora's pituitary gland didn't produce enough growth hormones, which led to delayed physical development. Outwardly, she looked much younger than her peers, and adults often treated her like a child. Barbora couldn't come to terms with such treatment and began using her condition for manipulations. She pretended to be an orphan in need of care and attention so that adults would help her and let her into their homes. In her teenage years, Barbora deceived one family with her unhappy appearance, who agreed to adopt the poor girl. However, during the procedure, the deception was revealed, and Barbora was sent for treatment to a psychiatric hospital. Having escaped from the clinic, the girl tried to do the same with another family. The deception was revealed again, and this time, Barbora's own parents sent her to another psychiatric institution for treatment, where she had to spend a long period of time. Barbora was discharged from the hospital when she was already over 20 years old. Barbora met Clara's sister, Katarzyna, at work in a social center. They were almost the same age and immediately found a common language. Everything was going normally until Barbora, starving for attention, wanted to become a child again. But last time, when she pretended to be an orphan, she was exposed. The woman didn't want to return to the psychiatric hospital, so she decided to share her plans with her friend Katarzyna. Any sane person in Katarzyna's place would probably refuse, but she unexpectedly agreed. None of the colleagues even guessed where Barbora Skrlová suddenly disappeared, and meanwhile, she was diligently working with her friend to look like a child. Barbora went to extreme measures. She lost a lot of weight, losing more than half her weight, to look younger. She started dressing in bright children's clothes with cartoon characters. In addition, she had breast reduction surgery or vacuum aspiration. She was ready for anything to turn into a little defenseless orphan. After a few months, having recovered from the surgery, Barbora was ready for her new image. Together with Katarzyna, they came up with a fake backstory for the girl Anichka, who had endured many abuses by the age of 13. To enhance the effect, the women invented a non-existent leukemia diagnosis. All this was done only to pity Clara. Katarzyna and Barbora showed ingenuity. First, they had to forge identity documents, then obtain medical certificates confirming the fatal diagnosis. Third, Anichka needed to undergo a medical examination to get a certificate for adoption. That's when Katarzyna arranged with the neighbor's daughter to play the role of the orphan. The mysterious doctor who gave the mother strange recommendations regarding her sons and adopted daughter was Barbora herself. Clara was touched by the heart-wrenching story of the orphan and didn't even notice how the 13-year-old Anichka became something like a spiritual mentor for her, skillfully manipulating the vulnerable woman. Katarzyna didn't tell her sister who Anichka really was. The woman, on the contrary, did everything to prevent the deception from being revealed. She forged documents and hospital visits. It was Katarzyna who brought the neighbor's girl to the adoption court, who, unlike Anichka, was a real teenager. Barbora and Katarzyna managed to deceive the legal and medical systems, and since it was officially confirmed that Anichka was 13 years old, that she was a real person, and that she was an orphan, Clara was allowed to adopt the girl. So why did a 33-year-old woman, pretending to be a 13-year-old girl, infiltrate Clara's family and literally destroy it? It seemed she wasn't seeking financial gain, but simply enjoyed mocking other people. The answer to the question was hidden in Barbora Skrlová's family. Her father, Josef Skrla, was a member of a cult called the Grail Movement. known for its cruelty and mind control methods. Joseph headed the Czech branch. This cult broke people to rebuild them as they saw fit. For example, in 2008, one leader of the movement's faction was subsequently arrested for holding his female followers as slaves. The man forced women to do slave labor, treated them badly, subjected them to physical and psychological punishments. The conditions of their detention were so terrible that one of the women died. It was this that led to the cult leader's arrest. Fortunately, the other captives were freed. The cult's main beliefs were that by doing good deeds, followers could go to heaven after death. However, more importantly, performing these good deeds freed them from sins. That is, cult members could boldly break the law, insult others, and do whatever they pleased, knowing that it was all in the name of the higher good of humanity. The followers of this cult had strict beliefs regarding child discipline. They believed that for good upbringing, children needed to be kept in strictness, and that showing cruelty to them made the kids good people. Considering that Barbara's father was the leader of this cult, it's not surprising that she and her brother became followers. Then Katarzyna joined them. The women wanted Clara to become part of them too. They brainwashed her so much that she herself gave her offspring to be torn apart. The camera in the basement was hung so that other cult members could see Jakub and Andrzej's sufferings, as well as to control them when no one was home. The men and women from the Grail movement sect who watched the brothers' torments were not prosecuted. Later, the investigation found out that the cult members uploaded the mockeries of Jakub and Andrzej to the darknet, earning tens of thousands of dollars on the videos. Having learned all this information, the police arrested Jan Turek, Hanna Bashova, and Jan Skrlová, the people who lived in the cottage in the forest. But Barbara, the main suspect, was still at large. The Grail movement cult helped her leave the country with fake documents of another child. It turned out that Barbara not only changed her name, but also became a boy named Adam. She was hiding in Norway. The woman shaved her head bald, and for several months posed as a quiet teenager, allegedly arrived in Oslo from California. When teachers and other students began to notice some oddities in the silent young man, he disappeared. Barbara simply escaped from the shelter. The Norwegian police were looking for the boy Adam and only later learned that it was actually the 33-year-old Barbora Skrlová. The woman was caught in January 2008 and deported to the Czech Republic so that she could stand trial for what she did. The trial caused widespread public resonance in the country. All the defendants were found guilty, but the sentences varied. Clara and Katarzyna Mauerová received the harshest sentences, 9 and 10 years, Jan Turek got 5 years, Jan Skrlová and Hanna Bashova 7 years each. At the moment, all 6 criminals have been released. They calmly walk the streets and live their lives. Barbora Skrlová, who became the main figure in this case, whose story turned into a modern urban legend, received a shockingly small sentence, only 5 years. At the trial, the woman appeared holding a teddy bear and clutching a children's book, apparently hoping to the last that she would be acquitted as a minor or as a person with mental disorders. However, the examination didn't reveal any mental health problems in Barbara that could justify her actions. The woman to the last proved in court that the problem was Jakub and Andrzej, that they abused her, so they deserved such treatment. There was no answer to the question of why Barbora Skrlová pretended to be a teenage girl and infiltrated other people's families by deception. One can only guess what drove this woman. After her release, Barbara changed her identity once again and disappeared in an unknown direction. Local newspapers wrote that Skrlová settled in a remote village, away from people. But many are sure that she has infiltrated someone's family again by deception and is posing as another person. 2 years after this story, in 2009, the American psychological horror film titled Orphan was released. The main heroine, Esther, was inspired by the story of Barbora Skrlová, a cruel manipulator suffering from a rare disease. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.